Okay, well, I've entitled this presentation "Science of Design," and the point of it is basically this. You know how Louis Pasteur is supposed to have said that fate favors the prepared mind. This is actually quite a common idea that's out there. That's why we do things like education, right? Because we are educated, our minds are prepared to see things that we wouldn't be prepared to necessarily see otherwise. But I want to start off with this. I just took this picture literally half an hour before I walked over here. And it illustrates how things work for scientists. You know, scientists, we're looking for signs of stuff. Now, we've got a bit of a problem on our hands. We're dealing with two sets of samples, and we're hoping that those samples are the same. So, what do you think? Is the sample in rows 1 through 5 the same as the sample in rows 6 through 10? You don't have to be a molecular biologist. You don't have to really have studied this stuff too hard at all, do you? No, we've got a big problem here, because there's a whole bunch of degraded DNA in these samples. Okay, we knew that something had gone sideways, and it has. So right now, one of my colleagues and I are literally desperately trying to figure out how can we address this problem. Because our minds are trained in a certain way, we can see that these lanes are giving us a sign that is different from these lanes. Okay? Don't need to go into any more details other than I hope you can hear the pain in my voice, because this is really painful. This is what happens in science. You don't always see necessarily what you want to see, but we have to live with it. It's one of the commitments that we make as scientists. Some people talk about, faith and science as being two different things. Okay? They're not two different things. Science is built off a metaphysical foundation. That foundation tells us that data are important. What we see is somehow reflecting something about reality. Yeah. And the question is what? What is it telling us about reality? It's not. It's unforgiving, because those data we take in through our senses, they just don't always align with our expectations. Okay, it's hard. It would be kind of nice if they did, but kind of boring too. Okay, in this particular case, it's painful, but we have to accept it. What would happen if we just charged ahead and said, okay, everything in these lanes 6 through 10 is the same as lanes 1 through 5, so and just charged ahead? Would the world be a better place? Would we find out what we're wanting to discover? No. Okay. All we would do is waste a bunch of our time and a lot of money that isn't ours. So we have to listen to this sign, whether we want to or not. So let's look at some papers. Okay? Now these papers, I like them because they give signs of something that my mind is prepared to see. Now, I want to stress to you that they are written by people who want to see something else. So they're a lot like me. I want to see something else here. But, okay, as scientists, we can't deny data. So let's have a look at things here. First of all, I'm going to start off with Jesus. Okay? Because Jesus pointed out something important about signs. Then also he said to the multitudes, whenever you see a cloud rising out of the west, immediately you say a shower is coming. Okay? So he's dealing with people. We think of them perhaps as primitive people out there in the countryside growing, I don't know, olives or something. But they're not primitive. They can read the signs. They can take in data and they can interpret it in a predictive way. So they can know when showers are coming, and it's so. And when you see the south wind blow, you say, there will be hot weather. And there is. Then he says, hypocrites. You can discern the face of the sky and of the earth, but how is it you do not discern this time? So we could go into a big sermon now. We won't do it. But I do believe that human nature has not changed. When we don't want to see things, we can be remarkably inventive in somehow or other getting ourselves all twisted up instead of looking at what data actually point to. So first paper that I want to draw your attention to, it's kind of a shocker for me because, that Miller-Urey experiment, if you are a science person at all, you are probably overly familiar with it. It is something that is trotted out as a sort of foundational experiment when it comes to chemical evolution. It's the first step in understanding how we go from unliving chemicals to living things. And the thing that, let's take a look at the experiment. This is how it's often diagrammed. The real glassware didn't quite look like this, but the idea was this. You've got water down here at the bottom, you're heating it up, the steam is going up here into this atmosphere, and the atmosphere is kind of special. It's a reducing atmosphere. It's made up of methane and ammonia and nitrogen and obviously water vapor. And then energy is being put in, and then the water vapor is condensed on this side, and this closed system keeps cycling. And after a while, what was noticed was that this water started changing color to a sort of brown brown stuff in there, and it turned out that there were some of the amino acids that that we're made out of, and every other living thing in this water. That's pretty impressive. It's made by nothing. To make those amino acids in our body actually requires an unbelievable globally distributed network of microorganisms that is taking nitrogen out of the air and ultimately giving us amino acids of one kind or another, and then these metabolic pathways that exist within our own bodies to make some of those amino acids, and we're dependent on other things that we eat to get the others that we need so that we can make our own proteins out of those amino acids. This short circuits that whole thing, all of that complex machinery, all of those just magical, almost biochemical pathways. It somehow made it look easy. But, and this is what one of their devices, they actually made several of them, but this is from the papers they published, this is what one of them looked like. Pretty significantly different from the way you usually see it diagrammed, but functionally the same. So this is what the authors of this paper wrote. They said, our results demonstrate that silica and silicates drastically enhance Miller's prebiotic synthetic routes, affording important differences in the yields, in the number of products, and their increased chemical information described by the number of carbon and nitrogen atoms composing the molecules, which are obtained starting from one carbon atom and one nitrogen atom precursors. Irrespective of the possible lack of correspondence of the early Earth atmosphere with that originally proposed by Miller and Urey, these results show the efficiency and the prebiotic worth of the borosilicate spark discharge system. Wow. Talk about people wanting to see something when they've just seen a big problem. It turns out that the glass that Miller-Urey experiment was done in was a vital component. It's a catalyst in there. And these guys did some very elegant experiments to demonstrate this. How much glass was lying around on the surface of the early Earth? How much borosilicate glass was lying around on the surface of the early Earth? Now, were there silicates? I'll leave that for you geologists to figure out. Do those really contribute to this? That's kind of another associated question. But at the end of the day, as somebody who is more into organic chemistry than inorganic chemistry, I've got to tell you, in the presence of a reducing atmosphere, I'm not personally imagining, and that's what you have to do, a situation where you have massive surface area of silicates to provide a catalytic surface on which to produce large quantities of the basic building blocks of organic molecules. Fate favors the prepared mind. My mind apparently was prepared in a little bit of a different way than these authors, and I don't want to mock them, okay? I am deeply grateful for the opportunities that I had as a graduate student. That was in a very secular environment. some lovely people and so on. I'm not criticizing it, but I will tell you that, yeah, in a lot of education, you spend your time being trained not to see things that are right in front of you. In fact, this is a problem, not a solution for this Miller-Urey thing. So here's a conclusion for you. Miller and Urey designed a machine for making reduced carbon molecules and showed that it is possible for intelligent minds to do this. Okay? What is surprising is that neither they nor most who followed them realized how the device actually worked. Okay? Even though this was pushed out in every textbook that it could possibly be mentioned in, didn't know how it worked, with the glass acting as a catalyst. The fact that glass was necessary for the product yields they achieved adds yet another component that would be necessary on an early Earth to make some of the building blocks of life. Note also that putting these building blocks together to make a living organism requires information, and minds are the source of information. One other thing that I don't point out here is catalysts do not accelerate reactions in only one direction. Okay? They accelerate things in both directions. So what they do is they allow equilibrium to be reached faster. But they do not guarantee the kind of excess yields that you really need to start having if you're going to start producing dimers and trimers and polymers of these organic molecules. A dilute solution of this stuff is not going to get the job done for you. You need a whole lot of it. You need to drive the reaction very hard, and furthermore, you need to drive the reaction very hard in such a way that it greatly favors certain kinds of bonds over other kinds of bonds. It really isn't a solution. Let's look at another paper. Positive interactions are common among culturable bacteria. That's interesting. These guys actually looked at a whole bunch of bacteria. Obviously, it's much easier to work with bacteria that you can culture versus bacteria that you can't culture. So they cleverly chose their subject matter. And they were looking for something. They were actually expecting something. Remember, a paper doesn't get published if it doesn't have a little bit of a surprise in it, right? I don't get to publish a scientific paper that says Monty Fleming woke up this morning, based on observations that I have made. That's not surprising. Maria woke up this morning. So what? You publish things about stuff that's a little bit surprising. Why would it be surprising that there are positive interactions between bacteria? Well, here's Charles Darwin writing. He says, and we have seen in the chapter on the struggle for existence, remember that in the Darwinian view of things, it is struggle that is a major driver. Without struggle, you do not get change. Struggle for existence, that it is the most closely allied forms, varieties of the same species and species of the same genus or related genera, which, from having nearly the same structure, constitution, and habits, generally come into the severest competition with each other. Consequently, each new variety or species, during the progress of its formation, will generally press hardest on its nearest kindred and tend to exterminate them. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that because we're talking about bacteria here, all bacteria are kind of like the same kindred or something. certainly not. There's great diversity out there in the prokaryotes, but it is struggle that is the expected thing that according to Darwinism. And we don't just expect it with small organisms that we can't see. I took this picture a few years ago in Masai Mara, and it sort of symbolizes every one of those, let's go out to the African plains and make a video. They seem to all start out with the lion chasing things, or the, something is killing something, and oh, look at that, the struggle for survival on the African plains. Is that real? Yeah, sure it is. But is it the defining characteristic of life? No. Actually, if you go out there and look around, what you see are zebras and warthogs and elephants and quite a collection of other animals, all of them happily living together. They don't even seem to be fighting for territory. They sort of stick with each other. Wildebeest, they kind of really like, and buffalo and stuff. But overall, they just sort of all seem to be, there's a lot of resource partitioning that goes on. So they're not really in direct competition with one another. Most of the organisms are pretty much getting along most of the time. It's, yes, there is predation and stuff, but it's more the exception than the rule. I like Tennyson. I like the English language, and he really struggled with the death of one of his friends, and he wrote this poem called In Memoriam. Anyway, and this is part of it. Are God and nature then at strife, that nature lends such evil dreams? So careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life. So careful of the type, but no. From scarped cliff and quarried stone she cries, 1,000 types are gone. Yeah, thousands of organisms, they've just gone extinct. I care for nothing, all shall go. Who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with raven shreked against his creed. You can see how people at this particular point in history, at least in the West, were struggling with this evil that they saw in nature, struggling with the fact that people die. There is struggle out there. Okay? And they're really, really, really focusing in on this at the exclusion of everything else. Okay? They get blinded by it. And yet, when we go and we look, what do we find? Do we find nothing but struggle, nothing but competition? No. What we find is that positive interactions, often described to be rare, occur commonly and primarily as parasitisms, and they're using this word parasitism here in a way that we're not used to. Okay, parasitisms between strains that differ in their carbon consumption profiles. What they really mean here is a kind of interdependence. They're helping each other out. Okay, they're helping one another out. So one of these strains of bacteria needs a certain carbon source. and the other one provides it. They're dependent. That's what they're calling a parasitism here, which is not the way I've seen it usually used, but anyway, just so you understand. Notably, non-growing strains are almost always promoted by strongly growing strains, 85% of the time. Now, bacteria, they don't bleed, so they can't be red in tooth and claw, okay? But, go out and look at nature yourself. Go out and just take a look. Are bees in some kind of terrible competition with flowers? Are those fungi that you see sending up their mushrooms every now and again and toadstools around the campus here, are they in a struggle to death with the trees and the grass that they live with? No. They actually cooperate together. Symbiotic. It's a very symbiotic relationship, yes. In fact, if you take away the fungi, the plants struggle to survive. So Darwin, he's saying, nature is red in tooth and claw. Everything is driven by competition, and thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. Okay? Is that really what we see out there? Okay? Is there a struggle for survival? In fact, there is. Okay? But is it the predominant principle? You could not exist were it not for the fact that you are an ecology. You yourself, that zoo you've got down here, okay, without that, you are not going to survive. And it's not just in here. It's all over your body. There's all kinds of little things doing all sorts of stuff for you. And were it not, again, for those organisms that are mediating the nitrogen cycle, and we're just a small part of the carbon cycle, obviously, but all of these things, they're all working together and cooperating so that you can eat corn chips for lunch and beans and rice, and so that you can digest that food and use it and it doesn't kill you. War of nature? Survival is about cooperation in nature. Cooperation and interdependence are the prevailing themes that we see for life to survive. Is nature broken? Yeah. That's why there's a struggle. So, struggle between and within species is a central principle of Darwin's theory of evolution. It is true that life can be a struggle for existence, but as often as not, this struggle involves cooperation between species rather than war between them. Thus, central principles of nature that allow life to survive include interdependence and cooperation, characteristics reflecting the character of the Creator described in Scripture, rather than the merciless mechanism of Darwinian evolution. Now, I don't know how long we can go on this afternoon. Do you want to look at another paper, or do we want to stop and have some Q&A? Keep going? All right. Oh, yeah, I've got plenty more. You'll notice I'm going off pretty recent stuff in the last year or so. Anyway, a mechanism of gene evolution generating mucin function. Oh, I love this. What's up your nose? Mucus.
I do have one question on the previous.
Sure.
Is there any organism that lives in complete isolation?
No. No. You know,
No such thing as a
yeah.
completely free-living autotroph.
And I think that in itself is an argument against chemical evolution.
Right.
Exactly. The complexity that would be necessary
Right.
for an organism to live independent of any other living thing, I don't know whether it's even possible in theory,
Right.
but in practice, it's not a practical proposition.
Think how large the minimum genome size would be because it's got the ability to.
Well, exactly, yeah. You know, we talk about minimum genome sizes, but we're always talking about parasites that are taking everything, and we're still talking about hundreds of genes.
Let me steel man that. How about those, what are those bulbous looking things where you kind of put the topper on it and those things live for like 100 years? You know what I mean? Like there's a little environment in there.
Right.
And the
Oh, yeah.
whole- And like, could you not then have maybe a small.
A terrarium.
A terrarium, yes. Could you not have a small, again,
Yeah.
I'm steel manning this thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you not have a little organism that could do all of that within itself? I mean, of course, it would all
Well,
have to come together.
let's put it this way. I can't answer your question, okay, in the way you have it framed. Okay,
Reframe it for me.
is there an organism where you can just have the one in there? And the answer to that question is no one's found it, if it exists.
You can't use dirt. It's got to be able to make its own dirt.
Well,
Why
that's,
can't you
yeah.
use dirt? 'Cause dirt is not living.
But a lot of
Well,
the dirt
soil.
came from like lichens, eroding rocks, and
A lot of organic acids. Are,
Right.
Organic acids actually
Humic
have
acid.
a big role in soil formation.
Yes.
I don't believe in this
Yeah.
nonsense.
Well, no, it's a good question. Look, as a scientist, I myself prefer to go with what has been observed, right? If somebody can come up with an organism that can actually do that, that will be impressive. Like if they can engineer one. But that will demonstrate that you can engineer one of these things, not that you're going to get one of them
By random chance.
by random chance. However, you know, having said that, man, can you imagine all of the reactions in the nitrogen cycle being going on in one organism?
photosynthesis.
Yeah, and photosynthesis, and respiration. Yeah, you've really got to deal with some pretty spectacularly dangerous stuff when you are producing these mild nutritious chemicals that we take in when we eat other things or in our own bodies. Lots of free radicals, lots of things that can go sideways in a very big way. You're not going to get to any of these things via small steps and you know, simple, short biochemical pathways. For everything you manufacture in a cell, there are a whole series of other problems that must be solved. Yeah.
Including the biggest problem would be the buildup of waste products. Because when you grow bacteria in a
Yeah.
culture, they can even cannibalize other dead bacteria for nutrients. But at some point, the toxic waste builds up so much that it becomes inhospitable unless it off-gases that somehow or flushes it out. So in a closed system, I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, and then, you know, one of the big questions is it plausible to expect inorganic processes to take care of things like the buildup of waste products? And what kinds of sources and sinks do you have in nature that you can appeal to try to balance things out, at least for a while? So how long do you have, you know,
Thermodynamics would disprove this pretty easily, because you essentially then have a machine that is just, the power that it's consuming, it then uses, and then it's reusing it, and we know that that's not possible.
yeah, but okay, I'll play the devil's advocate here, and I would say the response to that is no. You're thinking probably mostly of the second law of thermodynamics, and that's really referring to a closed system. And one of the reasons that terrariums work is because they're not a closed system. Even when you've got them sealed off, you're putting light in there, you're putting energy in, right?
That's right.
So when you're putting energy into a system, you might be able to drive a certain thing. You also need to be getting rid of heat,
You're
okay?
absolutely
Because
right. Yeah, I
heat
agree.
is another waste thing that you must get rid of, or you're going to cook everything in there. But this stuff is complicated to think about. That's one reason why I prefer what's been observed over
Theory.
theories about what may or may not have happened.
Sorry to
Yeah.
go off track.
Anyway, no worries. Let's talk about this, because talking about boogers just after you've eaten is kind of cool. Think about all the stuff mucus actually does in your body, right? It's not just up your nose, okay? It's not just coming out when you've got a cold or COVID or something like that. It's lubricating things, right? It's taking that food on its journey through your gut. It's insulating the surface of your stomach from the acids and stuff that are being produced in there, and the enzymes that break down proteins. It's really, really, really important stuff, especially in mammals. This is basically what the authors say. By integrating bioinformatic, phylogenetic, proteomic, and immunohistochemical approaches, we identified 15 undescribed instances of evolutionary convergence where novel mucins originated by gaining densely O-glycosylated exonic repeat domains. Basically what's going on here is you're taking proteins and you're adding a whole bunch of sugars to them. Sugars love water, right? So that's what makes mucus work. It's these chemicals that hang on to a whole bunch of water and then have these physical properties that work great for allowing you to breathe in and out and lubricating the surface there that your lungs are moving against. I mean, it just goes on and on. Mucus is great stuff, but 15 undescribed instances of evolutionary convergence. What does that mean?
Sharing information.
Same
It
genes used over
may-
and over in organisms that are not
No,
supposed to be.
not exactly.
Or is it?
What it means is the same solution is being found using different proteins. 15 different times you have mucin proteins evolving in a single group of organisms. That group of organisms happens to be absolutely dependent on mucins for their survival. You expect, right, if you're believing in an evolutionary mechanism of things, to start out with the mucus that you need, and then you might get branching. What you don't expect is different proteins springing up all over the place in different groups, and not always in ways that fit that branching pattern. Yeah.
Right, it just proves that evolution works.
Maybe it does. You know, you create evolution creates a group of organisms that needs mucins, and before they die out because they don't have mucins, they evolve them. You know, that's not logic that really works in biology, but I know you're a geologist. You know, I'm sorry. It's you know, this is you've got to have what you need before you need it in biology, or else you can't live. So you've all seen these phylogenetic trees where everything makes sense. We would expect that there'd be an ancestral mucin gene that shows up here, and these two closely related organisms would share that same mucin, and then as we go back down through our tree, we see the same mucins being shared by this broader and broader group. That's at least the theory. The practice is exactly the opposite of this. They just show up all over the place, and it's different proteins popping up and being used for this. You can make up a more complicated story. You can say, well, maybe way back here at the bottom, there are a whole bunch of mucin genes, and they got knocked out as these things drifted apart. But then you have no explanation for where the mucin genes came from in the first place, and you're pushing a difficult problem back in time without solving it. Yeah. No.
But couldn't they say at first they were all the same, and then later each branch developed its own protein?
No. If you look at this paper, they're definitely not saying that. No, these are really different proteins. Okay, they're not a single protein that you see a pattern of modification to as following the pattern of diversification. That's definitely not what you see there. So here's a conclusion for this particular one. Because evolution of new proteins and functions is generally recognized as improbable, the Darwinian explanation for characteristics shared between species involves inheritance from a common ancestor. This is how you deal, at least to some degree, with the probability problem. Thus, common characteristics are interpreted as evidence of common ancestry. In this case, we see exactly the opposite pattern. Ironically, this is still interpreted within an evolutionary framework. Designers routinely use dramatically different devices to achieve the same end because they have a goal in mind and can conceive of different ways of achieving the goal. Yeah. So think of how many different ways there are of opening a can of beans. Designers can come up with all kinds of different stuff, right? That's what designers do. But they don't all have the same origin. They have distinct origins. That's what these mucins look like. And this is not the only example of this sort of thing. It just seemed like a good one. Oh, okay. Let me give you this last one really quickly, okay? Simultaneous optimization of earwig, hind wings for flight and folding. Okay, so imagine a situation where you have to optimize for two very different things at the same time. That's really hard to do. Okay, that's why God gave us things like calculus. And even then, it's not all that helpful sometimes. Natural selection, we know that it can do certain things, like it can select for birds not flying. That's why flightless birds are not uncommon on remote islands, because, hey, they don't need to fly, and flying is a very costly thing. Without selective pressure to keep flying, birds get lazy and they stop flying, okay? Just look at this. This is just great. Okay, you've seen earwigs. They're plentiful around here. You didn't know they fly, did you? Yeah. But underneath these things, you can see their wings actually sticking out here. Well, do you think they can fly with a wing that long? No. No. Their wings are one of the most complex folded bits of origami in nature. Here you can see I've done mean things. You can see the wing in there. It's all folded up in this spectacular way. Now, it's not just that it's got to be folded up. Okay? That's one really complex problem. When it's unfolded, it has a whole series of areas that are designed to fold, right? Wings, you don't want them folding when you're trying to fly with them. Okay? That's not the way things should work. It doesn't work that way. If your wings fold up, you stop flying. So they've got to have a way of folding them up that allows them to unfold and remain relatively stiff in flight as they use them as wings. That's the simultaneous optimization that's going on. Two things at once to achieve this extremely complex outcome. This is just a diagram of the wing when it's unfolded, and they find that there's special areas that have been strengthened in certain ways so that when it's unfolded, it is optimized for flying, and but it can still fold up in this remarkable way. The flapping flight of earwigs around 50 hertz necessitates a transition between the stable folded state of the wings and the stable unfolded state, which is a major challenge. Yeah, I agree. If our assumption is correct and earwigs belong to slow-flying insects, we expect that 1, their wings are very flexible and exhibit significant deformation during flight. 2, their wings reveal extensive distribution of wrestling, which is a specialized material that you find in insects' wings that allows flexation in them. But it's like stiff enough, okay, in the veins to support these deformations. So when they're flying, the wing is actually not absolutely stiff. It is flexing as well, but it isn't folding back up and it's not collapsing. And 3, clearly identifiable flexion lines adjust the wing shape during flight. Because you can't just have a wing that's flexing all over the place. If you do, you get flutter, and this is one of the things that causes planes to crash and stuff. Bad design allows that. Then, of course, the question arises how the two mechanisms, mid-wing mechanism and clavicle flexation line stay in place during wing deformations. What you're really looking at here is an engineering triumph. Okay. Not a simple linear evolution of something. This is one of the most complex wing problems I've ever encountered. So the conclusion, random wing folding may result in a compact but useless wing. To achieve a wing that both folds efficiently and supports powered flight requires simultaneous optimization of multiple variables. Minds have been shown to be capable of designing objects that at least approximate this, but unguided processes appear unlikely to be capable of optimizing for both folding and flight at the same time. And remember, this is a specific kind of flight that these insects are exhibiting, but I don't have enough expertise to go into it, but apparently there are multiple modes of flying that insects use. Let's see here. But unguided processes appear unlikely to be capable of optimizing for both folding and flight at the same time. Specifically, incremental steps under the influence of natural selection face the problem of incremental changes being detrimental rather than providing an adaptive advantage. When I look at this sort of thing, I see design. And I could probably just as easily show you another 5 or 10 papers that I've looked at in the last month or so that scream the same thing. Fate favors the prepared mind. I hope that your mind is prepared to see design where it is in fact evident in nature. Thanks.